Okay, so there were some philosophers in sort of the mid-20th century who asked these questions. One was Gilbert Harman, the other was Daniel Dennett, and there's others who have talked about this as well. And they essentially said, what if we could take the brain out of the person and put it in a vat, okay, of substance that would sustain the brain's activity? And the essential question was, what if we could separate consciousness from the body? Okay. And so things like brain transplants would raise the same question, that if you had a brain transplant and you woke up in the morning and you looked in the mirror and you saw that you were in another person's body, okay, who are you, okay, in that moment? That when your body substantially alters, totally different body in this case, but your consciousness, your mind remains the same, what does that say about consciousness? What does that say about personal identity? Who are you? Okay, so again, these ideas are not new. One of the more famous recent examples was 1997 with the movie The Matrix, with Keanu Reeves. This idea that he was just literally a brain in a vat, well, a body in a vat. If you've seen that film, humans are all harvested and grown in farms, and they use the heat energy of the humans to power the world, and they just create a kind of computer simulation for them to exist in, and they never exist in the real world. Okay, so that was 97. But this is a very old idea. This goes back to Descartes, the 18th century French philosopher, and arguably it goes back to Plato with the parable of the cave, okay, that we have always been kind of puzzled by our consciousness. So we'll just take Descartes as an example. In the 18th century in France, he had this idea of, well, a couple ideas of how do we tell the difference between sleeping and waking states. This is the philosophical tradition of what's called skepticism. How do we know what we know? What can we be skeptical about? And he said, how do I know that I'm awake when I'm writing this? I could just be dreaming it. Okay? And there are sort of answers to this question, but there's never been a really convincing one. I mean, we know the difference between waking and sleeping, that I'm pretty sure I'm awake right now. But again, at the end of the day, I'm not totally sure, okay, that this could just be a dream, all right? The other one that Descartes talked about was, what if there's an evil genius out there, some god figure or devil figure, okay, who's manipulating everything? And so this would be the Matrix, okay, that machines and artificial intelligence have taken over the world, and they are manipulating our experience of reality. You see this in different forms. Other movies that have done this is something like The Truman Show with Jim Carrey, where he's essentially a boy raised in a laboratory being monitored by social scientists to see what he's like in this completely constructed world. Pleasantville is another example of film that has done this, okay? And so that's very much on the human level of humans manipulating our worldly experience, but someone is out there stage managing everything. The Matrix is an example where AI is stage managing everything. Another kind of dystopian example would be something like The Terminator, where artificial intelligence gets away from us and starts to infringe on human dominion over the world and so forth. So there's been lots of different thought experiments about this. So this raises questions about our consciousness, right? That who are we as individuals, and how do we know, how we're experiencing the world? What are we supposed to make of this? So if we upload a consciousness, the mainframe brain drain, where does that consciousness go? Is it housed in a physical computer somewhere? Is it, we don't really know, that there has to be servers somewhere where this exists. So it needs to embody a physical space or be contained within a physical space, whether that's the body itself or whether that's in a computer. So who's responsible for maintaining that computer? If you do indeed have someone's consciousness on your phone or in a chip or whatever, what is your responsibility to that chip or that computer? Okay. Can it take care of itself, or do we need people to take care of it? Is this a burgeoning future field, being a custodian of people's consciousnesses over the centuries? I don't know, right? And movies have been made about this kind of thing. Okay? So we can think about this not only in relation to people and their consciousness, but also in relation to information, to knowledge, to technology, to creativity, and so forth. So, for example, what is the repository of our knowledge? That if we have human consciousnesses uploaded onto chips or whatever, disks, computers, doesn't matter, can we also upload information in the same way? Well, we do that already, okay? So how do we understand our relationship to the body of knowledge that we have constructed? Because this is a question that comes up in Tiger Flu, is that they talk about the time before and the things that they knew in the time before and how they've lost that knowledge. And this is a really interesting time for us because we have all this internet technology and things are up in the cloud. But, if you're ever unfortunate enough to have your computer crash and you lose a whole bunch of stuff from it, there's a massive loss of data. Personal photographs, writings you might have done, videos you've made, stuff you just have, right? Like, what are the contents of your phone or your computer? And if that disappears, what do you actually lose? Okay? And in a dystopian, catastrophic novel like Tiger Flu, they lose, arguably a massive percentage of human knowledge. Okay? So what happens if our computer systems suddenly crash? Okay? But it doesn't have to be something as catastrophic as, a computer failure. What if people burn books or censor books? What knowledge is lost in those kinds of activities of willful destruction or willful hampering of the free exchange of knowledge? Okay, that these are the kinds of questions that Tiger Flu is asking us to think about. That we have access to all this technology. What do we want to hang on to, and what do we want to get rid of? Okay, like currently we kind of keep everything. We document and store and contain everything, but when we run out of space, if we ever do, we may not, what do we want to retain? What's worth retaining? Cat videos or how to save someone's life? Okay. And so this argument has been made before. I mean, people have talked about this in very simple forms of technology, something as simple as writing. Neil Postman talks about this in one of his books, where he says, he uses it as a kind of parable in ancient times when someone came to a king and said, I've got this great technology of writing, and it allows you to write stuff down so you never forget it. And that's awesome. But the king replies in a really interesting way. He says, yeah, but if I write it down, then I won't keep it in my mind at the forefront of my thought, and I might actually forget it. Yes, it's written down, but I won't have it with me all the time. And this is just a different relationship to knowledge, right? That there's lots of knowledge out there, but do we access it all the time, right? Or is it better to keep a little bit of knowledge in our heads all the time, okay? And what is the balance? And so this comes back to ideas of consciousness, about identity, that what do we think, what do we know, what's important to us, what do we act upon, okay? We can write it down and forget about it, but then we read it and remind ourselves, oh, that was something, I should live my life by that principle, okay? And it changes us as individuals in what we do on a daily basis. So just as a point of interest for me, books, physical book that we actually have, these are amazingly stable forms of knowledge, right? And unlike digital stuff where you can get water damage, I guess you could get water damage to books, but you can still read it. But I can't access stuff on my 3.5-inch floppy disks from 20 or 30 years ago. That technology's pretty much gone. If I want to do that, it's a very difficult thing. But I can pick up a book from the 13th century and still read it if I understand the text, right? So these very stable forms of knowledge, like our bodies, okay, are great conduits of information. When we look at something like the mainframe brain drain and think uploading consciousness, how will technology change? Will we lose data in the process? I just wanted to add one more little detail from the book, is the idea of the scales that get implanted in Cora's head and other characters' heads, that these are essentially little microchips, that they can insert into their brains, and these are the repositories of historical knowledge. And this also raises interesting questions about things like books and or the access to technology, is that in the future, those scales are very rare and very expensive or difficult to come by. And so it's a form of privilege. And so that raises another class issue around technology and its uses, that who actually has access, who is privileged or rich enough or whatever to access this information. And that's another dynamic of the novel that we should keep in mind.